Okay, well, good morning, Ollie, and welcome to our series, Holy Envy. We're going to explore perspectives of the Spirit. And I think we should leave sufficient room for our faith for a holy envy, being open to the aspects of other faiths that we admire, so we can deeply wish that they were part of our own faith. So our speaker today is Pastor Nate Allen. Pastor Nate is pastor of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Fullerton. His previous ministry was an associate pastor at Claremont Lutheran Church in San Diego, and he served the Hispanic community there. He has a Master's of Divinity degree from Pacific Lutheran Theology Seminary, and he studied Spanish at La Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara. He was raised in Arcadia, California, and interestingly, his parents one is an attorney and the other a pastor, and so he was brought up with the law and gospel as a youth. He is married and he has 2 daughters. He and his wife are expecting a baby in July. Congratulations, Pastor. His presentation is inclusive, and I have a hard time pronouncing this, relationality. It's a word that's, he said, maybe is made up. But anyway, a biblical and philosophical interpretation. So please welcome Pastor Nate. And we're going to spotlight you, Pastor Nate. So he should appear large in everybody's screen. By the way, we will be recording this because we'll be able to offer this to our other OLLI members in the future. Our future program. So Pastor Nate, you're on, and would everybody please mute their mics? Looks like everybody has. Thank you very much. Okay, Pastor Nate.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you to Fritz for this opportunity, a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And so thank you for letting me be here, and thank you for joining, and I'm excited to hear your questions and your thoughts as we go along here. I'm going to be using 3 separate passages from the Bible for my presentation this morning, and after each passage I will leave time for questions, so if you have any questions, that would be the best time to ask them. And then also at the very end, when we bring everything together, we'll have more time for questions that you may have. Or maybe not. Maybe you won't have any questions, but we shall see. So I'm going to share my screen right now. So our first passage that we are looking at this morning is a very well-known one, of course. And this is kind of just to set the groundwork for what we're going to be talking about. Getting an idea about creation. So we're just going to go through this one a little more briefly than we will the other 2. Our middle passage is going to be on the Tower of Babel, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time, actually. So first of all, I just want to go through a couple things in the beginning of Genesis that relate to our topic of inclusive relationality. And so we start at the beginning. We see that it says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." So this is really important, of course. There's a lot of different ways that we could look at this text from Genesis, but how we're going to focus it is around God defining and distinguishing between different elements of creation. But first of all, you have this formless void and the darkness that covers the face of the deep. So we get this image of Genesis of this watery, chaotic beginning that was existing before God actually began the project of creation. So we understand that so just to get the image of this chaotic picture of what things look like before God started adding shape and order and defining things. So it's important to have that image as we go forward. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And here, this is really critical. And God separated the light from the darkness. Throughout this whole story, we get God separating one thing from another, distinguishing them, showing that they are separate things. And this is actually critical to all of creation. There has to be this separation for anything to really exist and have order and have meaning. So we need to have distinction and separation. Okay? And then it continues down. We know that God called the light day, the darkness night. There was evening and morning. Then God made the dome, separates the, I don't want to get too much into the understanding of the universe that is being expressed here, but the understanding was that there was water above the sky and water below, and that God is separating these two. And when it rains, there would be the water coming down from above. So that was their understanding of cosmology at this time. But I don't want to get too much in. The most important part is that he separates the waters from the waters, distinguishes them, and then they cause the dome sky. Okay, let's continue on. And then they gather the waters, the dry land appears, and they call the sea. So you have land and sea are separated. It's also good. And then the plants come out, the seed-bearing plants, fruits, all of that, vegetation, all of that coming out, and it was all good. And then there's the lights of the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. So more, giving more meaning and separation between the different aspects of creation. And then he has the sun and the moon. The sun is during the day, the moon is at night, plus all the other stars. And going down, then of course all the other living creatures in the waters and the birds that are flying. And then we get down, and then on the earth the creatures are starting to come out, and eventually God gets to humankind, making humankind in our image and likeness. So God created humankind. Just a note here, the word for humankind is also just a similar word to what is used for Adam later on in chapter 2. So it's actually God created it, and it's a singular word here in this, but it's interpreted to mean a stand-in for all of creation. And then God says, "Be fruitful." Down here, this is important. "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over and the fish." So this is really important. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This is a command from God that comes up again later on in the story after Noah and the ark. God gives a similar command to go out, to be fruitful, and to fill the earth, to spread out, and not to stay in one place together. Okay, that's what I want to focus on for this. There's a lot of stuff, of course, we could talk about the Genesis story. There's really so much to talk about there, but our emphasis right now is on that separation. And so for the philosophical kind of interpretation of this, I'm basing it on a book. It's called The Beginning of Wisdom by Leon R. Kass. Very interesting book. Highly recommended if you like philosophy. This would be good. And it combines philosophy with looking at Genesis. So it's a really interesting book to read. But there's some quotes here I want to go through that can help us understand what we're talking about here. So we could say that the fundamental principle through which the world is created is separation. Creation is bringing of order out of chaos, largely through acts of separation, division, and distinction. So this is critical for our understanding of how God creates. And down here, it's talking about how God created through speech. Speech implies the making and recognition of distinctions. To name something presupposes mentally seeing it distinctly. To predicate or combine words in speech is to put together what mind has first seen as separate. Separation, otherness, distinction, or if you prefer, the principle of contradiction, that is, A is other than not A, is the very foundation of the possibility of both speech and of an articulated world. So it's critical in this understanding to notice how God creates using words, using speech to define things. And this is a part of how we structure our world in our brains. We have to separate out and see that one thing is different from another thing, and that's how we create meaning. So this is critical to understanding creation as well. And then in terms of the Sabbath day, which is the seventh day, Leon Koss says, God hallows the seventh day, and in so doing sanctifies the principle of distinction by making distinction the principle of holiness. Kadesh, the root, not roof, the root of the verb to hallow means something separated, set off, or set apart. That's what we mean by when something is holy, right? We mean that it is something that is set apart. It is distinct from the common. Okay, so that is a part of the creation in general. Every week we're supposed to be reminded of that holiness and that set apartness by practicing Sabbath. Okay, we went through a little bit there, just trying to give a basic understanding, beginning with the beginning of Genesis, of what we're talking about today in terms of diversity and inclusion. Okay, so we're gonna move forward to our next story, and this is the Tower of Babel. So just leading up to this, of course, we had Adam and Eve in the garden. They were kicked out of the garden. Then you had Cain and Abel, and then they move on. It gets all the way down to Noah and the flood, and then Noah's family survives, right? And they come out of the ark, and then God commands them again to be fruitful and multiply. And right before we have the Tower of Babel story, we have the story, it's called the Table of Nations, and it lists all the descendants of Noah and his sons and what those different nations became over time. So that's what the context we have leading into the Tower of Babel. So I'm just going to read through this real quick. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bimutton for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So for some other contextual background here, the story of the Tower of Babel connects a lot to the Empire of Babylon. And that's obvious when you say it, right? You say Babylon and Babel, very connected, those words. But also in the way that they build, where it says here, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." This was actually very typical during that time period when the Babylonians were building. They had these big ovens that they would cook the bricks in, and they would use those for what they were building. So the way they actually describe this seems to be the person who's writing it knows a lot about how they built things in Babylon. So they don't have a complete understanding. It seems like they have some familiarity with that. So in some ways, this story of the Tower of Babel is also a play on this city of Babylon. And there was a tower in the city that was built and primarily to the god Marduk, but also they they had a worshiping of the celestial bodies. So the sun, the stars, the moon especially was worshipped by the Babylonians. And so a lot of what we find in Genesis is a push, of course, away from that worship of celestial bodies and towards the one and only true God. So in some ways, this is critical of it can be seen as being critical of the Babylonians themselves, their culture, as well as their religion. Okay? So I'm gonna read through this quote here real quick from another quote from Koss in his book about this story. So read historically as part of an ongoing temporal narrative, this tale of the universal city completes the account of the universal human story, with human beings living largely on their own and without divine instruction. Read philosophically as part of an unfolding anthropology, this reflection on language, technology, and the first prototypical city exposes fully the core of civilization and man as a rational and political animal. Read morally as part of a search for wisdom regarding how to live, this report of human failure prepares and encourages us to pay attention when, in the immediate sequel, God undertakes to educate Abraham in the new way of righteousness and holiness. So from Koss's interpretation of Genesis, you have God creating humankind, and then through Adam and Eve, but working through pretty much all of humanity at the time when the flood came. There was the rebelliousness with the flood, and then Noah comes out. All of the nations come from Noah. And then God is going to, instead of working through all of humankind, going to choose a specific people to work through, beginning with Abraham. And through Abraham, God is going to work through the people of Israel, and then to bring God's message back to the whole humankind through the one people group. So it's interesting how the story goes from God interacting with all of humankind to God interacting directly through Abraham and the people of Israel. And then, of course, from a Christian perspective with Jesus Christ, we move back again to that universal perspective, as we see later with the Acts of the Apostles, and the Holy Spirit descends down and everyone can speak the other people's languages. So that's kind of the direction, the flow, and why maybe God chooses to work through this man named Abraham. So that's the context coming of the whole story. God is going to use Israel to teach the other nations of the world. Okay, so coming down here to this quote, Babel, the universal city, is the fulfillment of a recurrent human dream, a dream of humankind united, living together in peace and freedom, no longer at the mercy of an inhospitable or hostile nature, and enjoying a life no longer solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So the question is, why is God against this? Why is God worried about this capacity in humans to dream up grand projects and the powers of humankind when working together for their desires? Is it because they lack pride? Is it because of their greed for power? Is it because they see themselves as being self-sufficient when they should be relying on God? Is it because they're viewing the heavens as being comparable to God? Is it idolatry, self-worship? Is it a threat to the earth in general? These are all questions that could be asked about why God is against human beings coming together in this way and having one language. So let's go into some previous context to talk about that. So we already talked about, we have the innocence, we have the garden. There was anarchy leading to the flood, the total destruction of humankind except for Noah. They had the externally imposed law and covenant after the flood. And then the dispersion of peoples and election of one comes next with Abraham, which we talked about. So Nimrod was the rebellious son of Noah and is the one who founded Babel, as we learn in chapter 10. He attempts to overcome by force the division of humankind. Human ordering is the theme of the story of Babel, attempting to order the chaos and instability just on the edge of creation. Though it is described as all people or all the earth, therefore it is a universal human project. Babel is not just any city, but it is the city, the paradigmatic or universal city representing a certain universal human aspiration. Being of one language, as Koss understands it, is to be of one mind, one perspective on the world. So he describes it in this way. The world as captured in language is necessarily partial, both incomplete and biased, and ever pregnant with the human impulse to do something to it. Language, therefore, conveys less the world as it is than it does the self-interested and humanly constructed vision of that world. So this is very typical understanding of language, of communication, but a lot of times the way that we understand the world is very limited, of course, what he's talking about here. And the way we use language kind of can confine us into a particular understanding. And in many ways, it can limit us from being able to look at other perspectives and be open to them if we're confined in that way. So being of one language means that this human constructed reality has become universal and pervasive. So this question, in the unity of outlook, there should be strength, right? That's something that we talk about a lot, that we should all be of one mind, we should all be of one perspective so that we can work together. That's really one of the questions that I struggle with all of this as well. It's seeing, okay, it should be good for us to be able to work together. So why is this a problem? All right. Power and technique are ethically neutral. They can be used both justly and unjustly. Worse, technical prowess, precisely because of its transformative power, creates the illusion that one can do without justice and morality. The omnicompetent city, lacking in justice, is a menace, both to itself and to the world. Even assuming that the inhabitants wish to be just, where will the builders of Babel find any knowledge of justice, or indeed of any moral or political principle or standard? Will they look to the heavens? No, these are also creatures. They are neutral. They reveal God's glory, but they say nothing about morality or justice. In this sense, their speech of the people of Babel becomes only self-referential. It fails to reveal what is true. And in church, we often call this preaching to the choir. So basically, it means that I'm just talking to people that already agree with my perspective. It's not going to move things along. And we pretty much see this completely when we look at our culture today, our society. We can see that most people are pretty much just talking to other people that agree with them already. And if you look on any place where there's some kind of discussion politically or otherwise in our society, it's basically there's no coming together of perspectives. It's everybody just saying, this is my perspective, and we disagree, but we're never actually going to find any kind of compromise or way to come together around this, because we're only talking to people who already agree with us. This is a huge problem for us as a society right now. And we're not able to see, in that sense, when we are wrong or when we are in error, because we're the only perspective available. If we don't have other perspectives to tell us when we're wrong, then we always think that we are in the correct place. With everyone given over to the common way, there would be mass identity and mass consciousness, but no private identity or true self-consciousness. There would be shoulder to shoulder, but no real face to face. Unity and homogeneity in self-creation are compatible with material prosperity, but they are a prescription for mindless alienation from the world, from one's fellows, and from one's own soul. God's punishment shows the inevitable consequences of the action of the humans building the city. Complete alienation and separation from each other. But through separation and division, God punishes and finds a remedy to their problem. The uniformity of language is the problem. Uniformity of perspective on the world leads to complacency and pride. And the dispersion of the peoples leads to separate nations, cultures, traditions, languages, perspectives on life. And it also reminds us of our own mortality. The people were in Babel were trying to come together so that they could protect themselves from the difficult world around them and from any division. But that's a false illusion that they were creating for themselves. The reality is that we are mortal and we are vulnerable. And we need to acknowledge that. Because when we acknowledge that we are limited and that we have partial knowledge, it actually leads us to search for eternal truths. It leads us to search for God when we have that perspective. And when we have multiple different ways of looking at a problem or an issue, it leads us to the best possible way. So we have when we have a multiplicity of perspectives, it's actually helpful for us to move forward. And it leads to more creativity as well. Okay. So it's about learning about how we are in need of God and how opposition and otherness are necessary for our own self-awareness and the possibility of seeking after what is truly good. I just finished a certificate program through Cornell University, so their online university, and it was on diversity and inclusion. And the main tenet of diversity and inclusion is that it will lead to more creativity and productivity. So a lot of times we have focused on diversity alone, but this class, it emphasized focusing on inclusion as well, which means people feel that they're a part of the group, and they feel that their uniqueness is valued. So you have to have both things for people to feel like they are important and that they can express their voice and their opinion. They have to feel like their uniqueness is going to be valued. And not just in a sense like, let's say, I use this as an example a lot, but our Synod Council for our denomination for this area that our church is in, we have a whole Synod Council, and for a long time there was really no people who were non-white on the council. And then my wife got nominated to be on our Synod Council, and she's from Mexico. And one of the big questions that she had was, am I on this just because I'm from Mexico and you need somebody who's Latina to be on this, or you actually want to hear my opinion and my perspective, and are you valuing my uniqueness in this? And this is what we come into a lot in our conversations around diversity, is that we often just want to include people because it looks good. But are we willing to be changed and transformed by listening to their perspective, by encouraging them in leadership and building them up? Are we going to be able to transform? And also they need to be willing as well. But when you're coming from the dominant group, we have to start with the attitude of being willing for transformation and welcome others in. Okay, now we get to some exciting stuff in Revelation. So this is Revelation chapter 7, and it is the 144,000 of Israel that are sealed, that are around the throne of God. So basically you have the angels are about to destroy everything, and then God says, wait, don't do it. Don't keep holding back the four winds until, the number of those who were sealed was 144,000. And basically it goes down and gives a list of all the tribes of Israel, and there was 12,000, 12,000, 12,000, also related to the disciples. So I wouldn't take this number literally for everybody out there, I would take this as a analogy or a metaphor, but the interpretation that I'm going with on this one comes from this book, which is Reading Revelation Responsibly. And that is by Michael J. Gorman, Reading Revelation Responsibly. And the perspective on this one is that this is talking about the church in general. This is a description of the church, okay? So the multitude from every nation. After this I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb." Normally, when I do these classes, I might go multiple weeks. So we would also talk about chapter 4, which gives the vision of the throne and the Lamb is on the throne. So suffice to say that the Lamb is the way that God chooses to work salvation, to work healing in the world. And so it's an image of God using weakness to work power in the world. Just to have that as kind of an understanding of what Revelation is about. And then it has all the angels around. They are singing their song. And then the elder says, "Who are these dressed in white?" "Sir, you're the one that knows." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple. And the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. They will hunger no more and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of the water of life. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Okay, so I'm going with an interpretation of this being a vision of the church. This is the church who have been liberated through the blood of Jesus Christ, who have been sealed with the cross of Christ in baptism forever. Okay, so they've been liberated and forgiven. The church is also symbolized in Revelation in chapter 12 as the woman who gives birth to Jesus and all the saints. That's also in the Catholic tradition interpreted as Mary, the mother of Jesus as well. So there's two different interpretations of that chapter 12. But these are the faithful witnesses. These are the ones who have stood true in their courage, in word and deed. And they have denounced falsities about God. They have not given in to the culture of idolatry that was prevalent at the time. Let me just talk briefly about that culture that was prevalent at the time when Revelation was being written. There was a cult known as there was a religion, but it's a cult known as the cult of the emperor during this time. This basically said that the emperor of Rome was a god. They had temples that were built to him, and it was really a part of their society at this time. They had parades, and they had big events. They had join in where all the people of the city would come out and they would have celebration. And a lot of the people who had become Christian in these different cities of Minor Asia, where John was writing to this book of Revelation, a lot of them had come from this culture that they had been a part of, this culture of idolatry to the emperor. And because it was so prevalent in the society, the people found it hard when they became Christians to leave it behind. They found it very difficult to get away from that. And the author of Revelation is encouraging the church to stay strong and committed to their faith in Jesus Christ in the midst of persecutions that happen because they are ostracized, because they don't go along with the culture that was prevalent at that time, because they don't go along with the emperor worship. They were ostracized from society, and some of them would end up even being killed for their beliefs or tortured or any other things. But a lot of it was just not being connected. being separated out from the rest of society, and that could cause issues with your business, could cause all kinds of problems for your family. But the church are those who have stood true through these testings. They have continued to remain loyal to Christ. And what we get here is a multinational, multicultural, multilingual view. And it's important to see that just as in the story of Acts, when the Holy Spirit descended and the people started speaking the languages of everyone else, it's not like the languages were taken away. The differences were not taken away. The distinguishments, all that was kept, but at the same time, they're united in something that goes even beyond that. They're united in Christ, who is the Lamb. So the faith in Christ is what is able to unite the church and continue to have the distinctions that separate them from one another. So the trick is, how do we maintain our distinction but be united together? And that's what the church is supposed to do, though I'm not sure we've been able to really fulfill this vision, and we probably never will. But that should be a vision for us as a church and what we want to look for. So this is a quote from Gorman in his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly. If Christians around the globe truly understood themselves as part of this international community and fully embraced that membership as their primary source of identity, mission, and allegiance, it is doubtful that so many Christians could maintain their deep-seated national allegiances or their suspicions of foreigners. So this is a part of his interpretation of Revelation, is to say that, and if we were able to get a little bit deeper, we would go back into the story of Abraham as well and understand him as a stranger, as a wanderer, and what that means for our relationship to strangers and wanderers as well. But the point is that we are not supposed to separate ourselves based on language and all these differences, but we're supposed to, as Christians, as the church now, we're supposed to become united with all of these differences intact. So we want to stay connected to the church as our ultimate allegiance, to Christ, sorry, not to the church, sorry, to Christ as our ultimate allegiance. And what happens a lot as Christians, we get, sometimes we can get co-opted. We make our culture, our tribe, our nation the ultimate, and that becomes a form of idolatry. One of the main themes of Revelation. Okay, like I said, if we would get into in further classes, if we had a longer period, the Jesus and the Lamb, we would talk about the beast. We would talk about the call to the churches in Revelation, the story of Abraham, and all of that.
It goes both ways. I attended the Black Baptist Church in Yorba Linda. I was welcomed, but was uncomfortable worshiping the same way. It was a different culture. And I grew up in a 50% black-white neighborhood.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I do think it goes both ways. And I think it's good for us to feel uncomfortable. I think it's good. We should do that more often. We should go into spaces where we do feel uncomfortable, because then we'll know what it's like more so to be a minority in a dominant culture, and we can have more empathy with them. So I think it's a good thing. And I do think maybe other churches that are primarily other demographics want to look at this as well and be encouraged to say, hey, we can also be willing to change. So yeah, I agree. I think it goes both ways. I think the impetus for us seems to be more because we're in the dominant culture. So when you come from the dominant culture, we need to maybe put the first foot forward a little bit more sometimes. But I do agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, we have a question. Today we are in the throes of chaos. How do we bring our people together to act with common goals? We want to live without fear.
Yes, so that to me is, I'm a big proponent of focusing on relationships. So that's how I see that we can change the hearts and minds of people, is through really growing in love and care for one another across differences. So while I may disagree with my brothers and sisters from the Missouri Synod, I also want to love and care for them. no matter what. And if possible, be able to have conversation with them about these issues. I've also have a history, a background in faith-based community organizing. And I think a lot of the skills that come from community organizing can be used to help us to grow in relationship better together, such as doing one-to-one interviews with people, doing more of a campaigns of getting to know whole organizations of people. There's a lot of skills that can be used through community organizing to do some of those, to get at some of these issues that we have. And of course, our society right now is so polarized. I think this is one of the most difficult things that we can possibly do, is to try to bring together people from differing political backgrounds. But I think it's the direction that we should go in, the direction that we should take. But we have to come at it from a perspective of really wanting to love and care for others and to learn about them. So a lot of it has to do with our perspective on life. When we go into conversations, are we going in to tell them everything I know? Which I feel bad. Normally I would want to have more, maybe a more interactive space, because this makes it feel like I'm just telling you all this stuff. But I would love to have more conversation with you in the future too. But are we going into our relationships, to our acquaintances, our interactions with people with a listening attitude? Are we going in to listen first and then share? Or are we going in to tell them how much they need to know about what we know? So it's a change of mindset too in how we interact with other people. And the skills of community organizing can help us learn how to do that. I don't agree with all of the stuff that community organizing does, but some of those things that they teach are really helpful to us. It helps us to reserve judgment on others by listening to their stories, getting to know their culture, getting to know what concerns them. Part of the work that we should do as churches is talking to people in our neighborhood, getting to know what are their concerns and their joys, what are they worried about that's happening in the neighborhood, and then see as a church how we can respond to that. But that could be any organization that wants to look at the community in which it's focused and related to, and learn from the community how we can be in ministry for and with them. It includes asking open-ended questions to people when we're in those conversations. And part of this whole issue too is that many of us are not aware of our own identity. We're not aware of where our families come from necessarily, or have taken time, although that's becoming more and more popular. I know with the DNA testing and all of that stuff, it's actually kind of nice because you get to learn a little more. My mom was adopted, so we don't know, where her family was. It's hard to have an identity like that sometimes. But it was nice. We did a DNA test and found out she's 20% Irish and 80% Celtic. So we got some Celtic, we got a lot of Celtic in there, which is helpful to me because it's about my identity as a person. When I know who I am, then I will not get defensive when I'm learning about who someone else is. When I'm confident in my faith, I'm not going to be worried about learning about somebody else's faith. I'm going to be excited. It's going to help my faith grow. But if I don't have a strong self-identity in who I am, then it's going to make it difficult for me to really listen to others and distinguish myself from them.
We got one last question, I think, Nate. Our time is running out.
Yep.
Just first a comment from John, loving God and loving people, and then from Wendell, why are the behaviors used in communion the focus versus the intent and desired outcome of those who participate, no matter the proceeding? And that's probably
it depends on which church you're talking to.
Yeah.
In terms of the Lutheran, that conservative Lutheran group, it's mainly because they feel that you need to fully understand what communion is before partaking, and they can't know if you fully understand until you've become a member of the church and taken their classes and all that. So that's where they're coming from in terms of limiting it. They think it's actually a sin if you take it without fully understanding in their perspective. So that's why they do it like that. I think that the focus has long been on behaviors. The focus has long been on how we celebrate communion. And it should, you're right, it should be focused on the intent of it, and which is the bringing together of the community in Christ, the being renewed by God's love and grace week in and week out. That is the intent of communion. So I think we should focus on that, and we can change the form. The form of it should be easily adaptable to whichever setting you may find yourself in. Unfortunately, because we've conflated the religion with the culture, that is very difficult to do. So we still have the picture of, which is fine. I get a lot out of it. I grew up in a traditional Lutheran church, so I'm fine with it as well. But, me standing up in front at the altar and doing all the stuff, that's what we view communion as, when we could view it as us sharing a meal together and remembering the last night that Christ shared a meal with his friends and saying the words of institution. It could be that simple. So I totally think that is an issue. And it's not just about communion, but about all of our traditions. We have to constantly reanalyze the way that we worship. And I don't mean to say that it's bad. I think that there's been traditions in the church that are very powerful, very meaningful, but not everybody understands those traditions. So we got to explain them, and we have to be willing to change them at times. And of course, I'm coming at this from a very religious perspective, because that's what, my work is in. I've just been on meetings about the diversity team and doing Latino outreach into our area in the Synod and stuff, and working with the Synod on that. So this is obviously on my mind a lot. So that's why I focus on that. But I think that these ideas, these values can be applied to in any number of ways.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pastor Nate, for talking with us this morning. And I want to remind everybody our next meeting will be June 25th. And we have Dr. Benjamin Hubbard. He is going to speak on cousins wars, why intramural religious strife can be so nasty. And so join us this at 10 o'clock on June 25th, Thursday. Everybody's welcome. And I think there are some things that have been discussed today that, yes, Pastor Nate, we could certainly discuss them further.
Well, can I just say real quick that I am planning to continue this theme with members of my congregation doing Zoom. If anybody's interested in continuing focus and looking at more passages in Genesis and Revelation and continuing this conversation, please contact Fritz. Is that okay, Fritz?
Yes, absolutely. I can get
I can get you that information. We'd be more than happy to have anybody join us to continue that.
Yeah, I can get the link out.
Okay.
Okay. And thank you, Ron, for helping today.
Oh, and thank you everybody for listening to me for so much. I know I probably talked way too much, but that was the name of the game today. But thank you so much for your time for this.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, bye-bye.